"I don't care what school uniform you're wearing. You two aren't boarding this train." Nash Thornfield's voice sliced through Chicago Union Station's marble halls like a blade as he stared down at the 17-year-old black twins. Shanice and Renee Beaumont clutched their first-class tickets, Wellington prep blazers marking them as students from one of the city's most exclusive academies. Other passengers on Platform 7 exchanged knowing looks. Another case of teenagers scamming their way into luxury accommodations they clearly couldn't afford. But then something extraordinary happened. The uncertainty in Shanice's voice disappeared. Her shoulders straightened. When she lifted her phone and looked directly at Nash, there was something burning in her dark eyes that made his condescending smile freeze. "We're calling our father," she said, no longer pleading, calm, controlled, absolutely devastating. Silence fell over Platform 7. Nash's hand stopped mid-gesture. Smirking passengers suddenly looked uncomfortable, because everyone just realized they had discriminated against exactly the wrong family. What happened next would shut down America's entire luxury rail. Chicago Union Station hummed with its usual controlled elegance on this crisp Tuesday morning in October. The Gothic Revival architecture soared overhead, its vaulted ceilings and ornate details creating an atmosphere of timeless grandeur. Travelers moved through the vast space with purpose, their footsteps echoing against polished marble floors that had witnessed countless journeys over nearly a century of service. The Capital Limited Luxury Service to Washington, D.C. was scheduled to depart in 90 minutes, giving the identical twins plenty of time to navigate what should have been a routine boarding process for their most important journey yet. The morning light streamed through the station's massive windows, casting long shadows across the bustling concourse where commuters, tourists, and business travelers converged in the daily symphony of American transportation. Shanice and Renee Beaumont had been planning this college tour trip for months with the meticulous attention to detail that had made them Wellington Preparatory Academy's most accomplished students. At 17, they carried themselves with the quiet confidence that came from years of academic excellence and careful preparation. Shanice, older by exactly 7 minutes, had already secured early admission to Georgetown University's prestigious pre-law program. Her acceptance letter, a testament to 4 years of perfect grades, extensive community service, and leadership positions that spoke to her natural ability to inspire and organize others. Renee, her mirror image in appearance but complementary in temperament, had captured the attention of George Washington University's business school with her perfect SAT scores and an entrepreneurial project that had raised over $50,000 for local literacy programs. Where Shanice was methodical and analytical, Renee was intuitive and creative, their differences creating a partnership that had dominated Wellington Prep's academic and social landscape since their freshman year. Their father, Terrell Beaumont, had finally agreed to let them travel alone on the family's luxury railway line after months of careful negotiation and demonstrated responsibility. This milestone represented more than just independence. It was recognition of their maturity, their ability to handle complex situations, and their readiness to begin transitioning from protected teenagers to young adults capable of navigating the world on their own terms. What made this trip even more special was that it marked the first time Terrell had allowed his daughters to experience the full luxury service that Beaumont Luxury Railways was famous for throughout the transportation industry. The Belmont Suite accommodations they'd been booked into weren't just first-class travel. They represented the pinnacle of American luxury rail service, with panoramic observation windows, personal concierge service, gourmet dining prepared by award-winning chefs, and amenities that had attracted celebrities, politicians, and business leaders for over 2 decades. But Terrell's decision wasn't about displaying wealth or indulging his daughters. As a father who had built his fortune from nothing, he understood that comfort and security during travel weren't luxuries. They were practical necessities that ensured his daughters could focus on their college interviews rather than worrying about cramped seating, mediocre food, or the unpredictable behavior of other passengers in standard accommodations. The twins approached the Beaumont Railway's premium service counter with the quiet confidence that came from excellent upbringings and completely legitimate business. Their tickets, printed at home on premium cardstock that bore the railway's distinctive watermark and security features, clearly showed reservations in the exclusive Belmont Suite car. The reservation confirmation numbers, booking reference codes and security holograms were all exactly as they should be, the documentation of paying customers who had every right to expect exceptional service. Their student IDs from Wellington Preparatory Academy were pristine, bearing the school's official seal, high-resolution photographs, and the signatures of both the headmaster and registrar. These weren't temporary identification cards or questionable documents. They were official credentials from one of Chicago's most prestigious educational institutions, the kind of school that regularly sent graduates to Ivy League universities and whose alumni included senators, federal judges, and Fortune 500 CEOs. Nash Thornfield looked up from his reservation system with the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of passengers over his 15-year career with Beaumont Railways. At 52, he had worked his way up from entry-level positions to become one of the company's senior customer service representatives, responsible for handling the most exclusive bookings and managing relationships with the railway's most important clients. But when his eyes settled on the two young black women in front of him, something shifted in his demeanor that would have been imperceptible to casual observers, but was immediately obvious to anyone who understood the subtle mechanics of institutional bias. The professional smile became strained, barely maintained through conscious effort. The welcoming tone that had characterized his interaction with previous customers turned cautious, guarded, and noticeably cooler. "Tickets and identification," he said, his voice now carrying an edge of suspicion that had been completely absent just moments earlier when he'd assisted a white businessman with exceptional courtesy, helpful suggestions about dining car reservations, and warm wishes for a pleasant journey. Shanice placed their tickets and student IDs on the mahogany counter with careful precision, her movements deliberate and respectful. The documents were arranged neatly, easily readable, with nothing hidden or unclear about their contents. "Good morning, sir," she said with the polished courtesy that Wellington Prep had instilled in all its students. "We're checking in for the Capital Limited service to Washington, D.C. Our reservation confirmation number is BLR 2847BS. Nash picked up their documents with hands that moved differently than they had for previous customers, less gentle, more suspicious, as if the papers themselves might be contaminated. His eyebrows rose dramatically as he examined the Belmont Suite reservations, a reaction that would have been completely inappropriate for any other passenger, but somehow felt justified to him when dealing with these particular travelers. He turned the tickets over, held them up to the light, and examined them with the kind of forensic scrutiny typically reserved for suspected forgeries or fraudulent documents. The Belmont Suite was the most exclusive accommodation on the entire Beaumont Railways network. A private car with floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows, personal butler service, a private dining area, luxury bedroom with Egyptian cotton linens, marble bathroom with rainfall shower, and amenities that cost more per night than most families spent on vacation packages. These accommodations were usually reserved for heads of state, Fortune 100 executives, entertainment industry celebrities, and the kind of wealthy individuals whose travel preferences were chronicled in luxury lifestyle magazines. The idea that two black teenagers could legitimately afford such accommodations challenged Nash's deeply held assumptions about who belonged in spaces of true privilege and luxury. "These don't look right," he announced, his voice deliberately loud enough for other passengers to hear, creating exactly the kind of public spectacle that would maximize the twins' embarrassment and reinforce the narrative he was constructing in real time. "Where exactly did you acquire these reservations? What happened at the security checkpoint would prove this was no accident." Renee's jaw tightened slightly, a barely perceptible reaction that spoke to years of training in maintaining composure under pressure. Her voice remained steady, professional, and respectful despite the obvious hostility she was encountering. "Our father booked them directly through Beaumont Railway's concierge service," she explained, with the patience of someone who had learned to over-communicate in situations where her credibility was being questioned. "The reservation was made 3 weeks ago through your Platinum customer service line. Is there a specific problem you'd like us to help resolve?" Nash's lips pressed into a thin line, his expression suggesting that their polite cooperation was somehow making him more suspicious rather than less. In his mind, legitimate customers would have been more aggressive in asserting their rights, would have demanded to speak to managers, would have exhibited the kind of entitled behavior he associated with people who truly belonged in luxury accommodations. "I'll need to verify these through corporate headquarters," he said, as if this were a routine procedure rather than an unprecedented step that he had never taken with any other passengers during his 15 years of service. "Wait here." He disappeared into a back office, taking their documents with him and leaving the twins standing at the counter like suspected criminals awaiting processing. This wasn't a brief verification call. It was a deliberate power play designed to humiliate them, to make them feel unwelcome, and to create exactly the kind of delay and public spectacle that would discourage them from asserting their rights as paying customers. The twins stood at the counter for nearly 20 minutes, while other passengers were processed efficiently around them. They could feel the weight of stares from fellow travelers, hear the whispered comments and speculation about what kind of trouble these well-dressed teenagers might be in, sense the assumptions being made about two black girls with reservations they obviously couldn't afford. Some passengers looked sympathetic, understanding that they were witnessing something unfair. Others seemed smugly satisfied, convinced they were watching justice being served, as obvious fraudsters were caught trying to game the system. A few pulled out phones to record what they assumed would be the inevitable exposure of teenage scammers who had overplayed their hand. During this interminable wait, Nash was actually making no verification calls at all. Instead, he was researching the Beaumont family name in the company database, trying to understand how these girls had obtained information that would allow them to make fraudulent reservations under what appeared to be a legitimate account. What he found in the system should have immediately resolved the situation, but his bias was so strong that he interpreted the data in ways that confirmed rather than challenged his prejudicial assumptions. When Nash finally returned, he placed new tickets on the counter with an air of false authority and barely concealed satisfaction. These weren't the original accommodations. They were coach seats in the standard passenger car, the kind of seating typically reserved for short-distance travelers and passengers who had purchased the most basic fare packages. "There was a system error," he announced with the tone of someone delivering unpleasant but necessary news. "You've been reassigned to coach seating in Car 7, Platform 7, Track 2. The lie was so blatant, so obviously fabricated, that several nearby passengers looked uncomfortable. There had been no system error, no technical malfunction, no computer glitch that would have randomly downgraded confirmed reservations. Nash had simply decided that these passengers didn't belong in luxury accommodations and had taken it upon himself to correct what he saw as an obvious mistake. Shanice examined the new tickets, her brow furrowing as she processed the magnitude of what had just happened. The coach seats were not just different accommodations. They represented a completely different class of service, with no meals included, no personal service, cramped seating designed for short trips rather than the overnight journey to Washington, and none of the amenities that had been specifically chosen to ensure their comfort during this important college tour. "But these aren't the accommodations our father reserved," she said, her voice still controlled but now carrying an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. "We're supposed to be in the Belmont suite. The confirmation email specifically shows those reservations, and we have the receipt showing full payment." Nash leaned forward across the counter, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper that was intended to be heard only by the twins, but carried just far enough to be picked up by passengers standing nearby. "Listen carefully," he said, his words dripping with barely concealed hostility. "I don't know what kind of scam you two are trying to pull here, but certain people need to understand that the Belmont suite isn't for everyone. You should be grateful you're getting seats at all instead of being escorted out of this station by security." The phrase, "certain people," hung in the air like poison gas, its meaning unmistakable to everyone within earshot. This wasn't about ticket verification or system errors or customer service protocols. This was about race, about assumptions, about who belonged in spaces of privilege and who needed to be put in their place. Renee's hands clenched at her sides, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of systematic humiliation. But Shanice placed a restraining hand on her sister's arm, a gesture born from years of coaching from parents who had taught them that righteous anger from young black women was too often weaponized against them by systems designed to punish any departure from submissive compliance. Our father specifically purchased Belmont Suite accommodations through your platinum customer service, Shanice insisted, her voice remaining level despite the rage building inside her. We have documentation, confirmation numbers, and payment receipts. I'd like to speak to a supervisor, please. Nash's smile turned predatory, the expression of someone who had been hoping for exactly this request, because it would allow him to demonstrate just how powerless these teenagers really were within the system he controlled. Supervisors in meetings all morning with the district management team, he lied smoothly. If you have a problem with your new seat assignments, you can take it up with customer service after you reach Washington. Next. The dismissal was absolute, final, and designed to communicate that further discussion would not be tolerated. Other passengers in line began to move forward, eager to distance themselves from what was clearly becoming an unpleasant situation that might delay their own processing. Humiliated, angry, and increasingly aware that they were facing systematic discrimination rather than isolated incidents, the twins collected their downgraded tickets and moved away from the counter. Other passengers stared as they passed, some with sympathy that they were too intimidated to express, others with the smug satisfaction of having their assumptions confirmed about teenagers who had obviously been caught trying to commit fraud. "We should call Dad right now," Renee whispered urgently as they walked toward the security checkpoint. "This is completely unacceptable." "No," Shanice replied firmly, though doubt was beginning to creep into her voice. "He has that crucial board meeting with the investors today. He specifically asked us not to call unless it was a life-threatening emergency. He's worked too hard building this company to have us interrupt something that important over travel problems we should be able to handle ourselves." "This feels like it's becoming an emergency to me," Renee insisted. "We'll handle it ourselves," Shanice assured her sister with more confidence than she actually felt. "Let's get through security first, then see if we can resolve this with someone else once we're past the checkpoint. Dad always says that most problems can be solved if you're persistent and professional." But what they didn't know was that Nash Thornfield was already on the phone with station security, painting a detailed picture of two suspicious teenagers who had attempted to use fraudulent reservations to gain access to luxury accommodations they obviously couldn't afford. He was describing them as potential security threats, possible identity thieves, and definitely the kind of troublemakers who would require close monitoring throughout their time in the station. The discrimination they'd just experienced wasn't an isolated incident. It was the first coordinated step in a systematic campaign designed to make their travel experience so unpleasant that they would never again attempt to access the kind of luxury services that people like Nash believed should be reserved for people who looked different than they did. What they found next was even more shocking than they could have imagined. The station security checkpoint should have been a routine formality. Shanice and Renee had traveled by train dozens of times throughout their lives, understood the standard procedures, and had packed their belongings carefully to avoid any complications or delays. They carried the standard items of well-prepared travelers: laptops for schoolwork, phones and chargers, prescription medications properly labeled, and the kinds of personal care items that any reasonable person would pack for an overnight journey. But as they approached the screening area, they noticed something deeply troubling that spoke to patterns of bias they had read about in academic studies but had never experienced so directly and systematically. White passengers were moving through the security process with minimal fuss, their belongings quickly screened and returned, their persons subjected to standard metal detector protocols, and their interaction with security personnel characterized by professional courtesy and efficient processing. Meanwhile, travelers who looked like them were being subjected to additional screening with suspicious frequency. Black passengers, Latino families, travelers wearing clothing that suggested Middle Eastern heritage, and anyone whose appearance didn't conform to the unspoken assumptions about who belonged in luxury transportation were being pulled aside for enhanced screening that seemed designed more to intimidate than to ensure security. "Random selection for enhanced security screening," announced Agent Kimberly Langston, with the kind of authority that was intended to discourage questions or challenges. But there was nothing random about the way her eyes had tracked the twins from the moment they entered the security area. Nothing coincidental about their selection for additional scrutiny that would delay their progress and create another public spectacle. Agent Langston was a 28-year-old security professional who had worked at Union Station for 6 years, gradually developing what she believed to be sophisticated instincts about which passengers deserved closer attention. In her mind, she wasn't discriminating. She was applying hard-earned experience about behavioral patterns, demographic risk factors, and the kind of subtle indicators that marked potential troublemakers. The fact that her instincts consistently targeted passengers of color wasn't something she examined too closely. She had developed elaborate justifications for her decision-making process that allowed her to maintain her self-image as a fair and professional security agent while systematically subjecting minority passengers to treatment that their white counterparts never experienced. The twins were directed to a separate screening area, physically isolated from the general flow of passengers and positioned where their enhanced screening would be visible to anyone passing through the checkpoint. This wasn't an accident. The visibility was part of the punishment, designed to create embarrassment and send a message to other passengers about what happened when people stepped outside the boundaries of where they belonged. Their carefully packed belongings were dumped onto metal tables with deliberate roughness, the contents scattered and examined as if they contained evidence of criminal activity. Agent Langston's hands were unnecessarily rough as she poured through their personal items, examining their electronics with exaggerated suspicion and handling their clothing in ways that felt invasive and deliberately humiliating. "What's this?" Langston demanded, holding up Shanice's laptop computer as if she had discovered a dangerous weapon or contraband device. "It's a laptop for schoolwork," Shanice replied with remarkable calm, her voice steady despite the growing awareness that she was being deliberately targeted for harassment. "I need it for my college interviews in Washington and for completing assignments that are due while we're traveling." Agent Langston opened the device and began scrolling through files, folders, and documents with no legal authority to conduct such a search and no legitimate security purpose that would justify this invasion of privacy. What she found should have immediately demonstrated that she was dealing with exceptional students, scholarship applications, research papers, academic correspondence with college admissions officers, and the digital portfolio of someone whose intellectual achievements were remarkable by any standard. "Lot of legal research on here," Langston said, her tone suggesting that academic excellence was somehow suspicious rather than admirable. "You some kind of activist troublemaker, planning to cause problems during your trip?" The question was loaded with false assumptions and designed to create a narrative that would justify whatever additional harassment she was planning to inflict. Shanice's legal research consisted entirely of scholarship application essays, AP government class assignments, and research papers for her early admission program at Georgetown, the normal academic work of a high-achieving student preparing for law school. "I'm interested in constitutional law," Shanice answered, with the careful precision of someone who understood that her words were being twisted and weaponized against her. "Those are research papers for my advanced placement government class and application essays for law school scholarship programs." Agent Langston's expression suggested that she didn't believe a word of this explanation, that in her mind, no legitimate high school student would have such sophisticated academic work on their personal computer. She spent additional time examining every file and folder, creating a deliberate spectacle that drew stares from other passengers and positioned the twins as suspicious characters who warranted this level of scrutiny. When she discovered Renee's prescription allergy medication, she held up the clearly labeled pharmaceutical bottle as if she had found illegal narcotics or dangerous contraband. "What are these pills?" she demanded, her voice loud enough to attract the attention of nearby passengers and create the impression that she was conducting a drug investigation. "Cetirizine," Renee explained with the patience of someone who had dealt with allergies her entire life and understood the importance of maintaining access to necessary medication while traveling. "It's an over-the-counter antihistamine for seasonal allergies. The prescription information is right on the bottle, along with my name, the prescribing physician, and the pharmacy where it was purchased." "Sirs," but Agent Langston was already calling for a supervisor, creating unnecessary drama around standard medication that was clearly labeled, legally prescribed, and completely routine for anyone who suffered from environmental allergies. Her supervisor, Agent Rodriguez, approached with the kind of theatrical seriousness that suggested they were dealing with a potential security threat rather than teenage passengers carrying legitimate medication. The enhanced pat-down that followed was invasive, humiliating, and conducted with a level of physical contact that made both girls profoundly uncomfortable. The agent's hands lingered in ways that felt deliberately inappropriate, while loud comments about their appearance, clothing, and behavior created a public spectacle designed to maximize their embarrassment. "Always have to be extra careful with these types," Agent Langston announced to her colleague, speaking as if the twins couldn't hear every word. "You never know what they might be hiding under those expensive school uniforms. Probably stolen anyway." A white woman standing in line behind them pulled out her phone to record what was obviously inappropriate harassment, but she was immediately approached by additional security personnel and forced to delete the footage. Any potential witnesses to the discriminatory treatment were quickly intimidated into silence, ensuring that there would be no independent documentation of what was happening. The systematic nature of the suppression was revealing. This wasn't the first time such incidents had occurred, and the security team had well-practiced procedures for eliminating evidence and silencing witnesses who might later corroborate complaints about discriminatory treatment. By the time they were finally cleared to proceed, 50 minutes had passed. Nearly an hour of their limited time before departure had been consumed by harassment that served no legitimate security purpose. Their belongings had been carelessly repacked, with items jumbled together, and some personal effects showing signs of rough handling. Shanice's laptop displayed new scratches from the careless examination, and several of their carefully organized documents had been scattered and would need to be reorganized. "Have a safe trip, girls," Agent Langston said with mock sweetness, her tone dripping with false courtesy that made her hostility even more obvious. "Better hurry. I hear they're really strict about boarding times for the Capital Limited. Wouldn't want you to miss your train after all this." The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Any further delays might result in missed departure times, stranded travelers, and the complete failure of their carefully planned college tour. Agent Langston was communicating that she had the power to destroy their plans entirely, and that they should consider themselves fortunate to have been allowed to proceed at all. As they rushed toward the dining area to grab a quick meal before boarding, Renee pulled out her phone with trembling hands. "We need to call Dad right now," she said, her voice finally showing the strain of systematic harassment that had consumed their entire morning. "This has gone beyond ridiculous. It's become harassment, and it's obviously coordinated." Shanice checked the time and shook her head, though doubt was now clearly visible in her expression. "He's in that closed-door session with the investors right now," she replied. His assistant specifically said he couldn't be disturbed for any reason, because they're negotiating a major expansion deal that could determine the company's future. "We'll handle this ourselves and tell him everything when he calls tonight." What they didn't know was that their father, Terrell Beaumont, was actually sitting in the executive boardroom of Beaumont Luxury Railways at that very moment, conducting his quarterly assessment of company culture and customer service standards. As the railway's founder and CEO, a position he kept private to shield his family from unwanted attention and to allow him to assess his company's operations without the artificial deference that his title would command, he was reviewing customer satisfaction reports and discrimination complaints that painted an increasingly concerning picture. The reports he was studying documented exactly the kind of systematic bias his daughters were experiencing at that very moment. Customer service scores for minority passengers were significantly lower than industry averages. Complaint patterns showed consistent issues with reservation changes, enhanced security screening, and restaurant service that disproportionately affected travelers of color. Employee testimonials, gathered through anonymous surveys, revealed a culture where discriminatory behavior was not just tolerated, but actively encouraged by management personnel who believed that certain passengers needed to be kept in their place. Terrell had suspected these problems existed, but he had needed concrete evidence before taking the kind of dramatic action that would be necessary to transform his company's culture. He had been planning a comprehensive intervention program, But he had wanted to gather more data, develop detailed protocols, and create sustainable solutions that would address root causes rather than just symptoms. He had no idea that the evidence he needed was being created in real time by the systematic harassment of his own daughters. Little did anyone know what was about to unfold on Platform 7. The Heritage Dining Car's station-side cafe represented everything that Beaumont Luxury Railways wanted to project about its brand: elegant decor, impeccable service, and the kind of refined atmosphere that attracted discerning travelers who expected excellence in every aspect of their journey. The restaurant featured rich mahogany paneling, crystal chandeliers, white linen tablecloths, and a menu created by award-winning chefs who specialized in contemporary American cuisine with international influences. Under normal circumstances, this would have been exactly the kind of establishment where the twins would have felt comfortable and welcome. They had dined in similar restaurants throughout their lives, understood proper etiquette, and carried themselves with the quiet confidence that came from excellent upbringings and legitimate belonging in spaces of refinement and privilege. But their morning experiences had already demonstrated that normal circumstances did not apply to them within the Beaumont Railway system. Their attempt to grab a quick meal before boarding was met with the same systematic hostility they had encountered at every other checkpoint, confirming that they were dealing with coordinated discrimination rather than isolated incidents of bias. The hostess, Megan Cartwright, was a 24-year-old employee who had worked at the Heritage Dining Car for 3 years, gradually developing what she believed to be sophisticated instincts about which customers would provide generous tips, cause minimal problems, and contribute to the upscale atmosphere that management wanted to maintain. Like many of her colleagues throughout the Beaumont Railway system, she had learned to make rapid judgments about passengers based on appearance, age, and demographic characteristics. When she looked up from her phone and saw the twins approaching, her expression immediately shifted from professional welcome to barely concealed disgust. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of microaggression that people of color had learned to recognize and navigate throughout their lives. "How many?" she asked, her tone noticeably different from the warm greeting she had given to the White family just ahead of them, whom she had addressed as folks and welcomed with genuine enthusiasm. "2, please," Shanice replied with the polished courtesy that Wellington Preparatory Academy had instilled in all its students, her voice betraying none of the frustration and exhaustion that was building inside her. Megan made an elaborate show of checking her tablet, scrolling through screens, and consulting what appeared to be complex reservation systems, though the restaurant operated on a first-come, first-served basis and rarely required such detailed coordination during mid-morning periods. "There's going to be about a 45-minute wait," she announced, with the kind of false regret that was intended to discourage rather than inform. Renee glanced around the restaurant, her trained eye immediately cataloguing the numerous empty tables that were clearly visible throughout the dining area. The lunch rush wouldn't begin for another 2 hours, and at least a dozen tables sat completely unoccupied, with clean linens and place settings ready for immediate seating. "But there are several open tables right there," she pointed out, with the kind of logical observation that should have immediately resolved any seating issues. "Those are reserved," Megan replied curtly, not bothering to look up from her screen and offering no additional explanation for why so many tables would be held for reservations that didn't appear on any visible booking system. Shanice pulled out her phone and navigated to the Heritage Dining Car's website, quickly locating their policies and procedures page. "Your website clearly states that you don't take reservations," she said, showing Megan the screen. "It specifically says that seating is first come, first served, and that parties are seated in order of arrival." Megan's face flushed with irritation at being confronted with factual information that contradicted her fabricated excuse. "Well, the website needs updating," she said with the kind of defensive hostility that people display when their lies are exposed. "We do take reservations now, and all those tables are spoken for by customers who made advance arrangements." As if choreographed by some invisible director, a white couple walked into the restaurant behind the twins, their timing so perfect that it seemed almost planned. Without acknowledging the ongoing conversation or the fact that other customers were already waiting, Megan's demeanor underwent another dramatic transformation. "Two for lunch?" she asked the newcomers, her voice suddenly bright with genuine warmth and professional courtesy. "Right this way. I have the perfect table by the window." She grabbed menus and began leading the couple toward one of the supposedly reserved tables, seating them with efficiency and attention that contrasted sharply with the hostility she had shown the twins just moments earlier. "Excuse me," Renee called after her, her patience finally wearing dangerously thin after hours of systematic mistreatment. "We were here first, and you just told us there were no tables available." Megan turned around with obvious annoyance, her expression suggesting that she was being subjected to unreasonable demands by difficult customers who didn't understand how restaurants operated. "Is there a problem here?" she asked with the kind of false innocence that was designed to make the twins appear to be the source of any conflict. The manager, Lance Sinclair, appeared as if he had been waiting for exactly this moment, monitoring the situation from his office and timing his intervention to maximum effect. His name tag identified him clearly as management, but his demeanor suggested that he had already decided how this interaction would end before hearing any details about what had transpired. Lance was a 38-year-old restaurant professional who had worked his way up through various positions in the hospitality industry, developing what he believed to be sophisticated understanding of customer service, conflict resolution, and operational efficiency. In his mind, he wasn't discriminating against anyone. He was simply maintaining the kind of upscale atmosphere that discerning customers expected when they chose to dine at premium establishments. "These girls are causing a disruption," Megan explained quickly, her version of events painting the twins as unreasonable troublemakers rather than customers who had been subjected to discriminatory treatment. "I told them we have a waiting list, but they're demanding immediate seating and making accusations about our policies." "That's not what happened," Shanice interjected with remarkable calm, her voice remaining level despite the obvious coordination between staff members who were working together to create a false narrative about the situation. "Your hostess told us there was a 45-minute wait, but there are clearly open tables throughout the restaurant, and she just seated people who arrived after us." Lance's expression didn't change as he processed this information. He hadn't taken his eyes off the twins since he had arrived, hadn't even glanced at the empty tables that were clearly visible throughout the dining area, hadn't acknowledged the couple who had just been seated at one of the supposedly reserved tables. His focus was entirely on the two young black women who were challenging his employees' authority. "I understand you're upset," he said, with the kind of condescending patience that adults often use when dealing with children they believe are being unreasonable. "But I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voices. We have customers trying to enjoy their meals in a peaceful environment." The accusation was particularly galling because both girls had been speaking in normal conversational tones throughout the entire interaction. But Lance was employing a common tactic used to control and diminish people who challenged discriminatory treatment, characterizing reasonable requests for fair service as disruptive behavior that threatens other customers' comfort. The threat was implicit but crystal clear. Comply with whatever treatment you receive, or face escalating consequences that could include removal from the premises and potential involvement of security personnel. Tabitha Ashworth, a 32-year-old Latina server who had worked at the Heritage Dining Car for 5 years, watched the interaction with growing concern and recognition. She had witnessed similar scenes dozens of times, had seen how management consistently found reasons to deny service to customers of color while accommodating white patrons who made identical requests. She approached the group cautiously, clearly wanting to help but also aware that challenging her supervisor could result in disciplinary action or termination that she couldn't afford as a single mother supporting 2 children. "Lance," she said carefully, "I can seat them at one of my tables. Number 8 just opened up and I can have them served immediately." "Stay out of this, Tabitha," Lance snapped without looking at her, his voice carrying the kind of sharp authority that was designed to remind her of the power dynamics within the restaurant hierarchy. "Go check on your other customers and let me handle this situation." Tabitha hesitated, torn between following orders from a supervisor she depended on for her livelihood and intervening on behalf of customers who were obviously being treated unfairly. She understood the economic realities that constrained her options. Challenging management could result in reduced hours, poor scheduling, negative performance reviews, or outright termination that would leave her unable to support her family. With an apologetic glance at the twins that conveyed both sympathy and regret, she retreated toward her assigned tables. But before completely disengaging from the situation, she discreetly slipped her business card into Shanice's hand. A small act of solidarity that acknowledged what was happening and provided potential contact information for someone who could serve as a witness if the twins decided to file formal complaints. The card contained more than just contact information. It represented validation that their experience was real, that they weren't imagining the discrimination they were encountering, and that at least one person within the system understood the injustice of their treatment. "Look," Lance said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that was intended to be heard only by the twins, but carried just far enough to be noticed by nearby diners. "I suggest you find somewhere else to eat. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone, and right now you're not welcome in this establishment." The message was unmistakable and legally questionable. While restaurants did have broad discretion in refusing service, that authority couldn't be exercised in ways that discriminated based on race, and Lance's pattern of behavior throughout this interaction had made his motivations transparently obvious to anyone who was paying attention. This wasn't about restaurant policies, wait times, or operational requirements. This was about who belonged in upscale establishments and who needed to be excluded to maintain what Lance saw as appropriate demographic composition for his clientele. Hungry, frustrated, and increasingly demoralized by hours of systematic mistreatment, the twins turned to leave the Heritage dining car. But Tabitha's small act of kindness, her willingness to bear witness to what she had seen and provide her contact information as potential support, gave them a crucial piece of evidence and, more importantly, hope that not everyone within the Beaumont railway system was complicit in the discrimination they were facing. As they walked toward Platform 7, using Tabitha's employee discount voucher to purchase sandwiches from a vending area, they had no idea that the worst confrontation was yet to come. The systematic harassment they had experienced at every checkpoint throughout the morning was building toward a crescendo that would force them to make a choice between accepting continued humiliation and taking a stand that would change everything. Little did anyone know what was about to unfold on Platform 7. Platform 7 was bustling with pre-boarding activity when Shanice and Renee arrived. The Capital Limited luxury service to Washington was on schedule, and passengers were already queuing for the premium boarding process. The twins checked their downgraded tickets one final time, coach seats 47C and 47D, a far cry from the Belmont suite accommodations their father had purchased. But something didn't sit right with Shanice. She pulled out her phone and accessed her email, scrolling through until she found their original booking confirmation. The discrepancy was clear. Terrell Beaumont had indeed purchased the Belmont suite, not the coach assignments they'd been given. "Look at this," she whispered to Renee, showing her the screen. "Dad's confirmation email shows the Belmont suite. Nash Thornfield lied to us." Renee's jaw tightened. "So what do? We can't exactly force our way onto the train." "We document everything," Shanice decided, her voice taking on the methodical tone that had made her Wellington Prep star debate team captain. "If we're going to fight this, we need evidence." They approached the customer service desk adjacent to the platform, where a harried agent named Paige Fitzgerald was processing passenger requests with mechanical efficiency. When the twins presented their case, original confirmation email versus current tickets, Paige barely looked up from her computer screen. "The reservation agent made the appropriate adjustments," she said dismissively. "If there was an error in your original booking, it's been corrected now." "But here's the email confirmation," Shanice insisted, showing her the screen. "My father specifically purchased Belmont suite accommodations." "This isn't an error, it's an unauthorized change." Paige finally looked up, her expression suggesting she was being asked to solve an impossibly complex problem rather than a simple reservation discrepancy. "I don't see any record of a complaint being filed," she said. "And even if there was an error, the Belmont suite is occupied now. There's nothing I can do." It was a lie, and they all knew it. The Belmont suite on this route was rarely occupied on a Tuesday afternoon, and Paige had the authority to restore their original accommodations with a few keystrokes. But she wasn't going to use that authority for two black teenagers who, in her mind, probably didn't belong in luxury accommodations anyway. Renee pulled out her phone to document the interaction, but Paige immediately became hostile. "Recording in the platform area isn't permitted," she snapped. "Put that away, or I'll call security." "We're not recording the platform," Renee replied calmly. "We're documenting our customer service interaction for potential complaints. Put it away." The twins exchanged glances. They were being systematically stonewalled at every turn, but they weren't going to give up. As boarding began, they watched first-class passengers glide through the priority lane with barely a glance at their documentation. When general boarding was announced, they joined the line with resignation, hoping that at least they'd be able to reach Washington and salvage their college interviews. But Owen Weatherby, the platform supervisor scanning boarding passes, had other plans. When the twins reached the front of the line, Owen examined their passes with exaggerated scrutiny. He held them up to the light, compared them to something on his tablet, and frowned as if he'd discovered a major discrepancy. "There seems to be a problem here," he announced loudly enough for other passengers to hear. "Please step aside while I verify these boarding passes." "What kind of problem?" Shanice asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "These passes appear to have been altered," Owen claimed. "I'm going to need to see additional identification." It was an absurd accusation. The boarding passes had been issued by Nash Thornfield just hours earlier and showed no signs of tampering. But Owen was creating a scene, drawing attention to the twins and painting them as potential security threats. "These are our student IDs from Wellington Preparatory Academy," Renee explained, producing their identification cards. "They have the school seal, our photos, and official signatures." Owen inspected the IDs with theatrical suspicion. "Student IDs can be easily fabricated. I need something more official." "We're 17, Shanice pointed out. "We don't have driver's licenses yet. The railway confirmed these IDs were sufficient when our father booked the tickets." Owen reached for his radio. "Security to Platform 7, please." "Security to Platform 7. The announcement echoed through the station, causing nearby passengers to stare and whisper. Some pulled out phones to record what appeared to be the apprehension of two teenage criminals. "This is discrimination," Renee stated firmly, no longer willing to pretend this was all just a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. "We have legitimate tickets and ID. You're delaying us because we're black." Owen's face flushed red. "That's a serious accusation, young lady. I could have you removed from this station for making false claims against railway personnel." But before the situation could escalate further, a new voice entered the conversation. "What seems to be the problem here, Owen?" The woman who approached was perhaps in her 50s, with dark skin and hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her name tag identified her as Simone Bradford, station supervisor. For a moment, the twins felt a surge of hope. Surely another black woman would understand what was happening and intervene on their behalf. They couldn't have been more wrong. What they discovered next would destroy everything Beaumont Railways thought it knew about power. Simone Bradford had spent 20 years climbing the corporate ladder at Beaumont Luxury Railways. She'd learned early that survival in the system meant not making waves, not challenging the status quo, and certainly not taking the side of passengers who complained about discrimination. She'd become exactly what the railway wanted, a black face providing cover for policies that disproportionately affected people who looked like her. "These two are claiming their boarding passes are fraudulent," Owen explained, deliberately mischaracterizing the situation. "They're making accusations of discrimination when I'm simply following security protocols." Simone examined their boarding passes and IDs with the same suspicion her white colleagues had shown, her expression suggesting she was dealing with troublemakers rather than legitimate passengers. "Is there some reason you can't follow standard boarding procedures like everyone else?" she asked, her tone sharp with disapproval. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Here was someone who should have understood, should have recognized the pattern of treatment they'd experienced, instead helping to perpetuate the very system that oppressed them all. "We've been following procedures all day," Shanice replied carefully. "We've been subjected to additional screening at every step, had our tickets illegally downgraded, and now we're being accused of fraud for trying to board with legitimate passes. Simone's expression hardened. I don't appreciate the attitude, young lady. If you continue making accusations, I'll be forced to deny you boarding entirely. The threat was clear. Shut up and accept the mistreatment, or face even worse consequences. Shanice looked at her sister, seeing her own defeat reflected in Renee's eyes. They were tired, hungry, and running out of options. Their college interviews were scheduled for tomorrow morning, and missing this train would mean missing opportunities they'd worked years to earn. Fine, Shanice said quietly. We'll board. But as Owen scanned their passes and they walked toward the train, both twins were documenting everything in their phones. They might have been forced to accept this treatment today, but they weren't going to let it end here. What they didn't know was that one final humiliation awaited them before they could reach their seats. The elegant corridor of the Capital Limited stretched ahead like a gauntlet, and at the entrance to their car stood Keith Harrington, Beaumont Railway's onboard services coordinator, examining boarding passes with the lazy authority of someone who'd made snap judgments about passengers for years. Most travelers flowed past him with minimal interaction, a quick glance at their pass, a nod, and they were through. But when Shanice and Renee approached, Keith's demeanor shifted into the now familiar pattern of suspicion and hostility they'd encountered all morning. Hold on there, he said, stepping directly into their path. I need to double-check something. What came next would shock everyone in Union Station. Keith took their boarding passes and made a show of examining them against a printed manifest, though it was clear he was simply stalling. The other passengers were forced to wait behind them, creating exactly the kind of public embarrassment that had characterized their entire station experience. These seats were supposed to be assigned to other passengers, Keith announced, though he was reading from no official document. There seems to be some confusion about your reservations. Shanice's patience, worn thin by hours of systematic mistreatment, finally reached its breaking point. There's no confusion, she said, her voice steady but firm. These are the seats we were assigned after our original Belmont Suite reservations were illegally downgraded. We've been harassed, delayed, and discriminated against at every step of this process, and we're not going to accept any more lies. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Keith's face flushed with anger. No one, especially not a black teenager, spoke to him with such directness. That's it, he snapped, reaching for his radio. Security to car entrance 7. Passenger removal required. Within minutes, 2 security guards appeared. Tom Bennett and Frank Miller both approaching with the aggressive posture of men who'd already decided the twins were the problem. What seems to be the issue? Bennett asked, addressing Keith rather than the twins. These two are refusing to accept their seat assignments and making accusations against railway staff, Keith explained, painting a completely false picture of the situation. They're becoming disruptive and interfering with boarding procedures. We are not being disruptive, Renee protested. We're simply trying to understand why our legitimate tickets keep being questioned and changed. Miller, the larger of the 2 guards, stepped forward with obvious intimidation. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to lower your voice and cooperate with railway personnel. We've been cooperating all day, Shanice replied, her voice remaining calm despite her rising anger. We've submitted to illegal searches, accepted unauthorized changes to our tickets, and endured systematic harassment. We're not going to be intimidated into silence anymore. The train corridor had become a public theater, with other passengers recording on their phones as the situation escalated. Some looked sympathetic. Others seemed convinced they were witnessing the apprehension of actual troublemakers. Recording security procedures is prohibited, Bennett declared, though no security procedure was actually taking place. I need everyone to put their phones away immediately. It was a lie designed to eliminate witnesses, but several passengers continued recording anyway, sensing they were witnessing something important. Keith pulled out a printed manifest and made a show of consulting it, though everyone knew he was simply trying to justify his earlier claims. According to this document, these seats were reassigned due to overbooking, he announced. These passengers will need to take alternative arrangements. The train isn't overbooked, Shanice stated flatly. I can see empty seats in first class through the car windows. You're removing us because you don't think we belong here. The accusation of racism hung in the air, and Keith's reaction confirmed its accuracy. his face contorted with rage at having his motivations called out so directly. "That's enough," he snarled. "You two are banned from this train. Security, escort them off the premises immediately." But Shanice wasn't finished. With the calm precision that had made her Wellington Prep star student, she pulled out her phone and began making a call. "We're calling our father," she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. Something in her tone, not pleading, not desperate, but coldly certain, made everyone pause. Keith, who had been gesturing dramatically to security, stopped mid-motion. The guards, who had been moving to physically remove the twins, hesitated. Because for the first time all day, Shanice Beaumont sounded like someone who had real power. "Dad," she said when the call connected, putting it on speaker so everyone could hear. "We're at Union Station, and Beaumont Railways is refusing to honor our tickets. We need your help." The voice that answered was calm, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Shanice, sweetheart, tell me exactly what's happening. Take your time." Keith tried to interrupt. "Miss, you can't make phone calls in the boarding area. Mr. Harrington," the voice from the phone cut him off with icy precision. "This is Terrell Beaumont. You will not interrupt my daughter again." The blood drained from Keith's face. Terrell Beaumont wasn't just any concerned parent. He was Beaumont Luxury Railways founder and CEO. The twins looked at each other in surprise. They knew their father was successful, but they'd never fully understood the extent of his influence in the transportation industry. "Now," Terrell continued, his voice carrying across the corridor for everyone to hear, "I want you to listen very carefully to what my daughters are about to tell you. Because what you've done today isn't just wrong, it's about to cost Beaumont Railways everything." The silence that followed was absolute. Security guards stepped back. Keith looked like he might faint. Other passengers pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something historic. "Shanice, Renee," Terrell said gently, "document everything that happened today. Every name, every incident, every witness. Because we're not just getting you home, we're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." And in that moment, everyone realized they had treated exactly the wrong family with such prejudice. If you believe that Shanice and Renee deserve to be treated with the same respect as every other passenger, type "respect" below. What followed would destroy everything they thought they knew about power. The train corridor fell into stunned silence as the implications of Terrell Beaumont's identity sank in. Keith Harrington, who moments before had been aggressively confronting two teenagers, now looked like a man facing his own execution. The security guard stepped back, suddenly uncertain about their authority. Other passengers pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Girls," Terrell's voice carried clearly through the phone speaker, "I need you to stay exactly where you are. Don't move, don't accept any offers from railway staff, and keep recording everything. I'm implementing Emergency Protocol Alpha right now." Shanice and Renee exchanged confused glances. "What's Protocol Alpha, Dad?" Renee asked. "You'll see in about 2 minutes," Terrell replied grimly, "and everyone who treated you like criminals today is about to learn why I kept my position in this company private." The twins had always known their father worked in transportation, but they'd assumed he was a regional manager or director. The revelation that he was the founder and CEO of Beaumont Luxury Railways, one of America's most prestigious transportation companies, recontextualized everything that had happened to them. Terrell had deliberately kept his role secret, even from his daughters, as part of his comprehensive strategy to assess the company's culture, without the artificial deference his title would command. He'd built Beaumont Railways from nothing into a luxury transportation empire, but he'd suspected for months that discrimination was festering within his organization. What he'd needed was concrete evidence before taking action. His daughters had just provided that evidence in the most personal way possible. "Mr. Harrington," Terrell continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of executive authority, "you and your colleagues have just subjected the CEO's daughters to systematic racial discrimination. More importantly, you've revealed exactly how Beaumont Railways treats black customers when you think no one important is watching." Keith's face had gone pale. He tried to speak, but no words came. "Shanice, Renee," Terrell said, "I need you to understand something. What happened to you today wasn't random. It wasn't a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. It was a systematic pattern of behavior that this company has allowed to flourish because people like Mr. Harrington believed they could treat certain customers differently without consequences. The departure boards throughout Union Station began flickering with updates. Train after train started showing the same status. Delayed. Maintenance inspection. "What's happening to the trains?" someone asked. Terrell's voice carried a grim satisfaction. "Emergency Protocol Alpha means every Beaumont Railways locomotive currently on tracks or in stations is being recalled for immediate inspection. Passengers already boarded are being returned to platforms. Every train in our entire network is being shut down pending investigation." The magnitude of the response left everyone speechless. Terrell had just paralyzed one of America's most prestigious transportation companies, over 150 luxury trains serving more than 10,000 passengers daily, in response to the discrimination his daughters had faced. "Sir," Keith stammered, "surely this is an overreaction to what was just a customer service issue." "A customer service issue?" Terrell's voice carried dangerous calm. "Mr. Harrington, my daughters documented systematic racial discrimination by at least 6 Beaumont Railways employees. They were harassed, humiliated, and threatened with arrest for the crime of being young, black, and successful. That's not a customer service issue. That's a civil rights violation that exposes decades of institutional racism this company has hidden from its board, its shareholders, and the public." Emergency announcements began echoing through the station as the shutdown took effect. Confused passengers approached service desks demanding explanations. The ripple effects were spreading beyond Chicago to every station Beaumont Railways served. "Now," Terrell continued, "I want every employee who interacted with my daughters today to report to the station's administrative offices immediately. We're going to have a very public conversation about Beaumont Railways' treatment of minority passengers, and it's going to be recorded for regulatory review." Keith looked desperately at the security guards, but they were already backing away. Nobody wanted to be associated with the discrimination that had triggered this crisis. "Shanice Renee," Terrell said, his voice softening, "you're not getting on that train today. Instead, you're going to help me transform this entire industry. Because what happened to you happens to thousands of people every day, and today it stops." But what the twins didn't know was that powerful forces were already mobilizing to stop their father's investigation and protect the system that had enabled their mistreatment. The consequences were just beginning to transform the entire industry. While chaos erupted at Union Station, an emergency meeting was convening in the mahogany-paneled boardroom of Beaumont Railway's corporate headquarters. The company's largest investor, Preston Kingsley, stared at the financial report streaming across his multiple monitors with barely controlled rage. Every shutdown train was costing the railway approximately $75,000 per hour. With over 150 locomotives affected, the immediate financial impact was approaching $11 million, and the numbers were climbing every minute. But the monetary losses paled in comparison to the reputational damage that was beginning to spread across social media and news outlets. "Get me Stephanie Reynolds in operations," Preston barked at his assistant. "And conference in the other board members, everyone except Beaumont." Preston had opposed Terrell's expansion plans from the beginning, arguing behind closed doors that the former tech executive lacked the cultural understanding necessary to run a major transportation company. What he'd meant, though he would never say it directly, was that a black CEO didn't belong at the helm of America's most prestigious railway system. He'd been outvoted by board members desperate for Terrell's reputation as a transformation specialist, but he'd never accepted the decision. Now Terrell had handed him the perfect opportunity to rectify that mistake. "Stephanie, I need you to handle something delicate," Preston said when Beaumont Railway's VP of Operations answered his call. "Beaumont's daughters are still at Union Station, and they're the source of this entire crisis. I need them isolated and contained before they can cause any more damage." Stephanie Reynolds had climbed the corporate ladder by understanding exactly what executives like Preston wanted, even when they couldn't say it explicitly. "What exactly do you want me to do?" "Get them away from public view. Offer them the VIP treatment, whatever it takes, but get them somewhere private where they can't talk to the press or post on social media. Frame it as protection from the chaos their father has caused. Stephanie understood perfectly. The twins needed to be silenced before their story gained more traction. Preston's next call was to Calvin Hughes, Beaumont Railway's IT director. "I need everything those girls have done today erased. Security footage, ticket records, employee reports, everything. Make it look like a system glitch if anyone asks." Calvin hesitated. "Sir, that would involve altering official records. If this becomes a legal matter, it involves protecting this company from a rogue CEO who's abusing his authority," Preston corrected sharply. "The board will back you up. Just do it." Within an hour, Preston had orchestrated a comprehensive counter-offensive. The railway's PR team began seeding stories about disruptive teenagers causing a scene at Union Station. Social media accounts with connections to Beaumont Railways started questioning the twins' character, suggesting they had manipulated their father into an overreaction. News outlets were receiving press releases, emphasizing the economic impact of the shutdown, while dismissing the discrimination claims as unverified allegations currently under internal review. Meanwhile, Stephanie Reynolds had arrived at Union Station with a security detail and was approaching the twins with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Shanice, Renee," she greeted them warmly, as if they were old friends. "I'm Stephanie Reynolds, VP of Operations. I can't tell you how deeply disturbed I am by what I'm hearing about your experience today." Her smile seemed sincere, her body language open and sympathetic. Behind her stood 4 security guards positioned at a discreet distance, but clearly part of her entourage. "Your father asked me to personally ensure your comfort and safety while this situation is resolved," she continued. "And we've prepared our executive lounge for you, away from all this chaos. Private facilities, comfortable seating, refreshments, anything you need." Shanice, still on the phone with Terrell, gave Stephanie a measured look. "Dad, Stephanie Reynolds is here. She wants to take us to the executive lounge." There was a pause before Terrell responded, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Put her on speaker." When Stephanie heard Terrell's voice, her smile faltered almost imperceptibly before she recovered. "Terrell, I'm so glad we connected. I just want to assure you that I had no idea about any of this until I got your emergency alert. I'm horrified, truly horrified, and I'm here to personally make sure your daughters are taken care of." "That's very thoughtful, Stephanie," Terrell replied, his tone carefully neutral. "But my instructions to Shanice and Renee were explicit. They are to remain in public view in the main terminal, where they can be seen by other passengers, and where any interactions with railway staff will have witnesses." Stephanie's smile tightened. "Of course I understand your concern, but really, with all the commotion and media attention gathering, it might be safer and more comfortable for them in the lounge." "Actually," Renee interjected, "we're quite comfortable right here, but thank you for your concern." Stephanie's carefully crafted facade began to crack. She leaned closer to the twins, lowering her voice so that only they and their father on the phone could hear. "Listen carefully. Your father has created a major crisis for this railway. Thousands of passengers are stranded, millions of dollars are being lost, and his position is becoming very precarious. The smart move for your family would be to quietly accept our hospitality and allow the adults to resolve this situation professionally." The threat beneath her words was unmistakable. "Is that a threat to my daughters, Stephanie?" Terrell asked through the phone, his voice dangerously quiet. Stephanie straightened, realizing she had miscalculated. "Not at all, Terrell. I'm simply concerned about their well-being in this chaotic environment." "Then you'll understand why they're staying exactly where they are, following my explicit instructions," Terrell replied. "And Stephanie, the next time you attempt to intimidate my children, clear out your office first. It will save you a trip back to collect your things later." The line went dead, leaving Stephanie staring at the twins with barely concealed fury. Without another word, she turned and walked away, a security detail following. But the twins didn't know that Stephanie was immediately calling Preston Kingsley, reporting that direct intimidation had failed, and recommending they escalate to more aggressive tactics. The battle was expanding beyond the station into a broader war for control of Beaumont Railways. What they also couldn't know was that their social media accounts were already under attack, with fabricated posts appearing to paint them as entitled troublemakers who had manipulated their father into overreacting. What happened next would surprise everyone about the power of accountability. Calvin Hughes stared at his computer screen in Beaumont Railway's IT department, his hands trembling slightly as he processed Preston Kingsley's instructions. Erasing security footage and altering passenger records wasn't just unethical, it was potentially criminal. But the pressure from the board was immense, and his job was on the line. As he initiated the deletion protocols, a notification popped up on his screen. Access denied. Security Protocol Alpha active. Calvin frowned. He had administrative privileges that should override any standard security protocols. He tried again, with the same result. Then he noticed something else, a small icon in the corner of his screen indicating active monitoring of his system. Someone was watching his every move. His phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Hughes," came a calm, intelligent voice when he answered. "This is Shanice Beaumont. I believe you're trying to access security footage from Union Station." Calvin nearly dropped the phone in shock. "How did you get this number? How are you monitoring my system?" "I'm something of a programmer myself," Shanice replied with matter-of-fact confidence. "Dad's mentioned you before, said you were one of the most ethical people in the IT department. That's why I'm calling instead of just logging your attempts to alter evidence." Calvin's mind raced. He hadn't considered that Terrell Beaumont's daughter might have technical skills of her own, or that she'd been anticipating corporate attempts to cover up what had happened. "Look, this is a misunderstanding," he began weakly. "No misunderstanding," Shanice cut him off. "I've been backing up evidence all day. Every interaction, every recording, every ticket change is stored on secure cloud servers that neither you nor Mr. Kingsley can access. I've also written scripts that are scanning social media for any altered posts, supposedly from our accounts. Did you know impersonation is a federal offense, Mr. Hughes?" Calvin felt sweat beading on his forehead. "I'm just following orders. From Preston Kingsley, not from the CEO," Shanice corrected. "You have a choice right now. You can continue trying to erase evidence of racial discrimination, which is itself illegal, or you can do the right thing." While Shanice was handling the IT director, Renee had been reaching out to witnesses they'd encountered throughout the day. Tabitha Ashworth, the sympathetic server from the Heritage dining car, had responded immediately to Renee's message. "I've been documenting Lance Sinclair's behavior for months," Tabitha wrote. "I've attached recordings I made secretly of him making racist comments about customers after you left. He told me to stop helping those people because they don't belong in first-class establishments." Other passengers who had witnessed their treatment at various checkpoints were finding them on social media, sending their own recordings and statements of support. The digital evidence was mounting, creating a counter-narrative to the corporate spin that Preston was trying to establish. But the attack on their reputation was intensifying as well. Fabricated social media posts supposedly from the twins' accounts began circulating, showing them bragging about manipulating their father, making racist comments of their own, and displaying entitled behavior that played into every negative stereotype. Shanice, anticipating this exact tactic, had already contacted Wellington Prep's IT administrator, Ms. Chen, who had mentored her in advanced programming. Together, they verified and published the twins' actual social media history, complete with timestamps and metadata that proved the recent posts were fabricated. These fake accounts were created within the last 2 hours, Shanice posted on her verified Twitter account. The IP addresses trace back to Beaumont Railway's corporate offices. Screenshot everything before they delete the evidence. The digital battle was becoming a public spectacle. Tech-savvy supporters began analyzing the fake posts, exposing the clumsy attempts at character assassination. Meanwhile, the authentic recordings and witness statements were creating an undeniable pattern of systematic discrimination. Preston Kingsley watched his carefully orchestrated cover-up collapse in real time. Not only had the twins anticipated his moves, but they turned his tactics against him, generating even more negative publicity for Beaumont Railways. "Sir," his assistant reported nervously, "the hashtag Beaumont Railways discrimination is trending nationally. We are getting thousands of reports from other passengers sharing their own experiences with discrimination on our trains." What had begun as an attempt to silence two teenagers had opened the floodgates to a much larger conversation about racism in the transportation industry. Current and former Beaumont Railways employees were coming forward with their own stories, describing a corporate culture where discriminatory behavior was not just tolerated, but actively encouraged. Calvin Hughes made his decision. Instead of erasing evidence, he began securing it, placing copies on protected servers where even executive access couldn't delete them. He sent Terrell Beaumont a direct message. "I'm preserving the evidence, not destroying it. I'll testify if needed." It was a career-risking move, but as he watched the coordinated attack on two innocent teenagers escalate, he couldn't be part of it any longer. By evening, what had begun as Preston's counteroffensive had transformed into a digital uprising. The hashtag was trending globally, with transportation passengers from around the world sharing similar experiences of discrimination. The twins' systematic documentation of their experience, combined with the obvious attempts to silence them, had created exactly the kind of authenticity that resonated across social media platforms. Preston's boardroom conspiracy was crumbling, but he had one final card to play, an emergency meeting that could determine not just Terrell's future, but the direction of Beaumont Railways itself. What they discovered next would destroy everything. The Beaumont Luxury Railways Emergency Board meeting convened virtually at 8 p.m. Eastern, with 12 grim-faced executives appearing on screens across the country. Preston Kingsley had spent the afternoon securing tentative support for his motion to remove Terrell Beaumont as CEO, framing the crisis as an emotional overreaction that was destroying shareholder value. "Colleagues," Preston began, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone who believed he was saving the company, "we face an unprecedented crisis. Our CEO has shut down our entire network over what appears to be a personal family matter, potentially violating his fiduciary duty to this company and its shareholders." The stock price had fallen 22% since the shutdown began, and the financial losses were mounting by the hour. Several board members nodded in agreement, their concern evident as Preston built his case methodically. "I move that we temporarily relieve Terrell Beaumont of his duties, pending a full investigation into his actions today. This isn't about race, as some are already suggesting in the media. This is about sound business judgment and fiscal responsibility." Before anyone could second the motion, Terrell appeared on screen, his expression calm but determined. The background behind him showed not his usual office, but what appeared to be a conference room, filled with documents and multiple computer screens. "Before you vote on Mr. Kingsley's motion," Terrell said, his voice carrying absolute authority, "I believe you should have all the facts." He pressed a button, and his screen was replaced by a series of documents, charts, and images that made several board members lean closer to their monitors. "What you're seeing is a comprehensive report on discrimination complaints against Beaumont Railways over the past 5 years, Terrell continued, his voice steady as steel. Complaints that were systematically buried by previous management that was appointed during Mr. Kingsley's tenure as executive chairman. The data was staggering. Discrimination complaints against Beaumont Railways were 340% higher than the industry average. Internal reports documenting this pattern had been deliberately concealed from the board and shareholders, creating massive legal and financial liabilities that could exceed $800 million. Preston's face flushed with anger. "This is a distraction from the matter at hand. Your emotional overreaction to your daughter's experience is costing this company millions." "My daughter's experience was not an isolated incident," Terrell countered, his voice steady as steel. "It was a textbook example of the discriminatory culture that has festered within this railway for years, a culture that represents massive legal and financial liability that has been concealed from this board." He switched to another screen, showing pending lawsuits and regulatory investigations. "These discrimination cases represent potential liabilities exceeding $800 million, none of which have been properly disclosed in our financial statements. That, Mr. Kingsley, is a breach of fiduciary duty." The room fell silent as board members processed this revelation. Eleanor Kim, the board's audit committee chair, was the first to recover. "Terrell, are you saying you were aware of these issues before today? When you hired me 6 months ago to transform this railway, I began a comprehensive investigation into company culture and practices, Terrell replied. What I discovered was a systematic pattern of discrimination, buried complaints, and intimidation of employees who spoke up. He paused, letting his words sink in. I was preparing a detailed plan to address these issues when my daughters experienced exactly the kind of treatment I'd been documenting. Their experience wasn't the reason for my actions today. It was the catalyst. Several board members were now watching Preston with new suspicion. The narrative was shifting from Terrell's supposed overreaction to Preston's potential liability for the concealed problems. Furthermore, Terrell continued, since implementing Protocol Alpha, I've discovered attempts to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and spread false information about my daughters online, all of which appear to trace back to Mr. Kingsley's direct instructions. Preston's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. These are wild accusations to cover for your own incompetence. If you continue with these slanderous claims, I'll use every resource at my disposal to destroy you, Beaumont. Your reputation, your daughter's futures, everything. The threat hung in the air for a moment, before Terrell smiled coldly. Thank you for that, Preston. I should mention that this entire meeting is being recorded, as per Company Bylaws Section 4, which requires documentation of all emergency board sessions. Would you like to rephrase your threat against my teenage daughters, or shall we let it stand for the record? Preston realized too late that he had walked into a trap. His carefully constructed facade of reasonable concern had crumbled, revealing the uglier truth beneath. Board members who had been leaning toward his position were now shifting uncomfortably, distancing themselves from his increasingly unhinged demeanor. Here's what's going to happen, Terrell continued, his voice level but authoritative. I'm implementing a comprehensive anti-discrimination program throughout Beaumont Railways, effective immediately. Every employee will undergo mandatory training. A third-party firm will investigate all past complaints, and our financial disclosures will be amended to properly reflect our legal liabilities. He looked directly at Preston through the camera. As for your motion to remove me, I welcome the vote. But let me be clear. If I'm removed, my first call will be to the SEC regarding the deliberate concealment of material financial liabilities. My second will be to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division regarding the systematic discrimination and subsequent cover-up attempts. The boardroom fell silent. Preston's motion died without a second. One by one, board members voiced their support for Terrell's plan, eager to distance themselves from what was clearly becoming a legal and public relations disaster. By the meeting's end, even Preston had been forced to abstain rather than stand alone in opposition to the comprehensive reforms. What happened next would surprise everyone about the power of accountability. The Beaumont Railways discrimination story exploded across national news the following morning. What had begun as coverage of an unusual railway shutdown had transformed into a major investigation of corporate discrimination practices. The twins, with their father's blessing, had published a detailed account of their experience, alongside all the evidence they'd gathered. Their post, simply titled, "What Happened to Us at Beaumont Railways," laid out each incident chronologically, supported by witness statements, recordings, timestamps, and documentation. It was measured in tone, factual rather than accusatory, and devastatingly effective because of that restraint. Within hours, the Beaumont Railways discrimination was the top trending topic nationally, with other victims of discrimination sharing their stories and creating an avalanche of testimony that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. Nash Thornfield, the reservation agent who had started the twins' ordeal, gave a defensive interview to a local Chicago station that only worsened his position. "I was just following procedures," he insisted, though he could not specify which procedures required him to downgrade paying passengers' reservations or subject them to extra scrutiny. When pressed by the interviewer, his response, "Certain people don't know how to behave in luxury accommodations," was caught on camera, confirming rather than refuting the accusations of bias. Kimberly Langston, the security agent who had conducted the invasive screening, was placed on administrative leave after multiple witnesses came forward describing her pattern of targeting minority passengers for excessive searches. The body camera footage that she claimed didn't exist was discovered in archived files, showing exactly the kind of biased treatment the twins had documented. Owen Weatherby, the platform's supervisor who had created false security alerts, was transferred to desk duty pending investigation. His history of passenger complaints revealed a troubling pattern of aggressive behavior toward travelers who didn't fit his demographic profile. The restaurant manager, Lance Sinclair, was suspended after Tabitha Ashworth provided recordings of his racist comments about customers. Her secret documentation of his behavior over several months painted a picture of systematic bias that the restaurant chain could no longer ignore. But the most significant development was in the corporate offices, where Preston Kingsley's carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Major shareholders began publicly distancing themselves from his leadership, with several institutional investors calling for his immediate removal from the board. His business reputation, built over decades of ruthless efficiency, began crumbling as the recording of his threats against the twins spread virally. The audio clip of his rage-filled voice, promising to destroy two teenage girls for speaking out against discrimination, was played on every major news network, creating exactly the kind of public relations nightmare that ended corporate careers. Meanwhile, the employees who had discriminated against the twins found themselves facing an uncomfortable spotlight. Their attempts to justify their actions only made things worse, as each interview revealed the depth of their bias and the systematic nature of the discrimination. Terrell Beaumont held a live press conference from Beaumont Railway's headquarters, with Shanice and Renee seated beside him. The image was powerful, a successful black family refusing to accept injustice, demanding accountability from institutions that had failed them. "What happened to my daughters was not an isolated incident," Terrell stated firmly. "It was a symptom of a systemic problem that has gone unaddressed for far too long. Today that changes." He outlined a comprehensive plan to address discrimination within the railway: mandatory anti-discrimination training for all staff, transparent reporting of all discrimination complaints, establishment of a passenger bill of rights, and creation of an independent review board with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary actions. Perhaps most surprisingly, he announced that the employees directly involved in discriminating against his daughters would not be summarily fired. "Termination might feel satisfying in the moment," he explained, "but it doesn't solve the underlying problem. Instead, these employees will participate in creating and implementing our new anti-discrimination training program, with their salaries during this period donated to civil rights organizations." True change requires education and accountability, not just punishment. The reaction to Terrell's approach was mixed. Some praised his focus on systemic change rather than individual scapegoating, while others felt the employees deserved immediate termination. The twins themselves supported their father's decision. "This isn't about ruining individual careers," Renee explained in a brief statement. "It's about changing a system that encourages and rewards discrimination." By mid-afternoon, the story had reached the White House, with the press secretary confirming that the Department of Transportation would be examining Beaumont Railway's compliance with anti-discrimination laws. Several members of Congress called for hearings on discrimination in the transportation industry more broadly. The transformation that had begun with one phone call at a platform was now reshaping an entire industry. Other railway companies, seeing the catastrophic damage to Beaumont's reputation, began implementing their own anti-discrimination measures preemptively. Stories of courage and justice like this inspire people all around the world. These young women proved that standing up for what's right can transform entire industries. Let us know what country and city you're watching from, so we can see how far these powerful messages of dignity are reaching. The final impact would change everything forever. 6 months after the incident at Union Station, Beaumont Luxury Railways looked like a completely different company. The transformation hadn't been easy. Changing a corporate culture that had enabled discrimination for decades required more than policy changes and training videos. It required a fundamental shift in how the company viewed its relationship with customers and employees. The Accountability Council that Terrell had created was meeting in Beaumont's Chicago training facility, a diverse group of 20 people tasked with redesigning the railway's approach to customer service and human relations. The council included civil rights experts, customer service specialists, former victims of discrimination, and, most surprisingly, the employees who had discriminated against the twins. Nash Thornfield sat uncomfortably at the conference table, listening as Tabitha Ashworth described the impact of workplace discrimination on employees who witnessed it but felt powerless to intervene. "Every time I saw Lance make racist comments about customers, I died a little inside," Tabitha explained. "But I needed my job. I have 2 kids to support, so I stayed quiet and hated myself for it." Nash shifted in his seat. 6 months of intensive workshops and testimonies had forced him to confront patterns in his own behavior that he'd previously rationalized away. The training wasn't just about learning new policies, it was about understanding the human impact of his actions. "I never thought of myself as racist," Nash admitted during one particularly difficult session. "I thought I was just doing my job, following procedures. But listening to all these stories, I realized I was creating different procedures for different people based on assumptions I didn't even know I was making." Kimberly Langston's transformation had been even more dramatic. The security agent who had subjected the twins to invasive screening was now working with federal authorities to identify patterns of bias in transportation security procedures. "I convinced myself that extra screening of certain passengers was keeping everyone safe," she said, during a recorded interview that would become part of Beaumont's training materials. "But when I really examined my decisions, I realized I was screening people based on stereotypes, not actual security concerns." The most profound change was in Simone Bradford, the supervisor who had betrayed the twins' expectations by siding with the discriminatory system. As a black woman who had adapted to institutional bias by enforcing its rules, she carried perhaps the heaviest burden of cognitive dissonance. Her breakthrough had come during a particularly difficult council session when a young black conductor described being told by a supervisor to tone down his natural speaking style because it made some passengers uncomfortable. "I said those exact words to a new hire last year," Simone had admitted, her voice breaking. "I told myself I was helping him succeed in the real world, but I was just perpetuating the same system that forced me to deny parts of myself to be accepted." The council's work was producing real results. Beaumont Railways had implemented the most comprehensive anti-discrimination program in the transportation industry. Every employee underwent mandatory training that went beyond superficial diversity exercises to address unconscious bias and bystander intervention. An anonymous reporting system allowed passengers and employees to flag concerning interactions without fear of retaliation. Most importantly, these reports were taken seriously, with real consequences for verified discrimination. The railway had also made structural changes. Hiring and promotion practices were redesigned to reduce bias. Customer satisfaction metrics were adjusted to ensure they didn't penalize employees for enforcing rules equally across all passenger demographics. And perhaps most significantly, upper management compensation was now partially tied to discrimination metrics, creating financial incentives for executives to take the issue seriously. Financial analysts had initially predicted disaster, with some forecasting that Beaumont Railways would lose up to 30% of its market value as it diverted resources to social justice rather than operational efficiency. Preston Kingsley, who had been forced to resign from the board after shareholder pressure, had been particularly vocal in predicting the railway's downfall. But something unexpected had happened. After an initial period of adjustment, Beaumont's customer satisfaction scores had begun to rise across all demographic groups. Employee retention improved as staff reported feeling more valued and less conflicted about their work environment. The anticipated mass exodus of business customers never materialized. In fact, several major corporations specifically switched their travel contracts to Beaumont Railways, citing its ethical leadership as aligning with their own corporate values. "We're seeing something remarkable," Terrell explained during a board meeting. "When you treat all customers with dignity and respect, when you create a workplace where employees feel valued, regardless of their background, the entire operation improves." Discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was bad business. The twins had become powerful advocates for change, speaking at conferences and working with other companies to implement similar programs. Their story had inspired young people across the country, showing that individuals could challenge systems and create meaningful transformation. But their real test was coming. In 1 week, they would be traveling Beaumont Railways again, from Chicago to New York, to see if the changes were real or just corporate theater. As they stood on Platform 7 at Union Station, the same platform where they had been denied boarding 6 months earlier, everything was different. The gate agent, a young Latina woman named Maria Santos, checked their boarding passes with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, ladies. The Capital Limited to New York today." She handed back their IDs without excessive scrutiny, treating them with the same casual efficiency she showed every passenger. "Yes," Shanice replied, still slightly amazed that this ordinary interaction, unremarkable to most travelers, represented such a profound change from their previous experience. They boarded the train without incident, settling into their first-class accommodations as other passengers filed past. The transformation wasn't just in policies and procedures, it was in the basic human dignity that was now extended to every customer, regardless of their appearance or background. As they departed Union Station, Renee looked out the window at the busy platform. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd just accepted that first ticket change?" she asked her sister. "Sometimes," Shanice admitted. "But then I remember Tabitha's recordings of Lance's racist comments, or Calvin's testimony about being ordered to delete evidence, or all the other passengers who came forward with their stories. This was bigger than just us." The conductor making the announcements was David Washington, a black man whose natural communication style would have been deemed unprofessional under the old Beaumont Railways policies. He moved through the train with confidence and pride, representing the kind of authentic diversity the company now embraced rather than merely tolerated. As the train climbed toward cruising speed, the twins reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The discrimination they'd faced had been real and painful, but their response had created ripple effects they never could have imagined. Nash Thornfield was now leading sensitivity training sessions for customer service representatives, using his own experience as an example of how unconscious bias could destroy customer relationships. His transformation from discriminatory agent to advocate for change had become a powerful testament to the possibility of redemption. Kimberly Langston had become a federal consultant on transportation security bias, working with agencies to identify and eliminate discriminatory screening practices. Her expertise in recognizing the patterns she'd once perpetuated made her uniquely qualified to help prevent future incidents. Owen Weatherby had left the railway industry entirely, enrolling in a master's program in social work. His experience of being held accountable for his actions had led to profound personal change, and he was now dedicated to helping others examine their own biases. Simone Bradford had been promoted to Director of Customer Experience, leading Beaumont's transformation efforts. Her journey from enabler to advocate had made her one of the most respected voices in corporate diversity initiatives. Even Lance Sinclair, the restaurant manager who had banned them from the Heritage dining car, had undergone significant change. The restaurant chain had implemented Beaumont's anti-discrimination model across all their locations, with Lance serving as a case study in the training programs. But the changes went far beyond individual transformation. The transportation industry as a whole had been forced to confront its treatment of minority passengers. Congressional hearings had led to new federal regulations requiring transparent reporting of discrimination complaints. Other railway companies had implemented their own accountability measures, though none as comprehensive as Beaumont's. The twins had testified before Congress, spoken at universities, and worked with civil rights organizations to expand their model to other industries. Their story had become a catalyst for broader conversations about institutional discrimination and the power of individual action to create systemic change. As their train approached New York, Shanice opened her laptop to review her notes for tomorrow's presentation at Columbia Law School. She was a freshman now, having deferred her admission by a year to work on anti-discrimination advocacy, Renee was at NYU's business school, focusing on corporate ethics and social responsibility. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our approach to New York," came the conductor's voice over the intercom. "On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for choosing Beaumont Railways. We know you have choices in transportation, and we appreciate your trust in us to provide not just safe travel, but service that honors the dignity of every passenger." The words were more than corporate script. They represented a fundamental shift in how the railway viewed its mission. Transportation wasn't just about moving people from one place to another. It was about treating every human being with respect and dignity. As they gathered their belongings in New York, the twins were approached by a young black girl, perhaps 9 years old, traveling with her family. "Are you the sisters who changed the train company?" she asked with innocent directness. Shanice knelt down to the child's eye level. "We're Shanice and Renee. What's your name?" "I'm Zoe. My mom said you made it so people like us get treated nice on trains." Renee felt tears forming in her eyes. This child would never know the fear and humiliation they had experienced. She would travel through the world with one less barrier, one less source of anxiety, one less reason to feel like a second-class citizen. "That's right, Zoe," Shanice said gently. "And you know what? If anyone ever treats you unfairly, you can speak up too. Your voice matters." The child nodded solemnly and ran back to her parents, who smiled gratefully at the twins before disappearing into the crowd. As they walked through the station toward their next chapter, Shanice and Renee knew that their experience had created something bigger than individual justice. They had helped build a world where that little girl, and countless others like her, could travel with dignity. What happened next would surprise everyone about the power of truth. 1 year after the incident that had shut down Beaumont Railways, the transformation extended far beyond a single company or industry. The Beaumont model had become a template for addressing institutional discrimination across corporate America, with over 300 companies implementing similar accountability programs. The twins were featured on the cover of Time magazine's Future Leaders issue, but they had never lost sight of why they'd fought so hard in that train corridor. It wasn't about personal recognition, it was about systemic change that would outlast any individual story. At a conference center in Washington, D.C., Shanice stood before an audience of Fortune 500 executives, civil rights leaders, and government officials. The annual Corporate Accountability Summit had become the premier venue for discussing institutional bias and effective remediation strategies. "The question isn't whether discrimination exists in your organization," Shanice told the assembled leaders. "The question is whether you're willing to acknowledge it and do the hard work necessary to eliminate it." Her presentation included data that was both encouraging and sobering. Discrimination complaints across the transportation industry had dropped 50% since Beaumont's transformation began. Customer satisfaction scores for minority passengers had improved dramatically across all carriers. But the data also revealed how pervasive the problem had been and how much work remained to be done. Renee, now a sophomore at NYU and founder of the Corporate Ethics Institute, addressed the business case for anti-discrimination programs. "Beaumont Railway's stock price has increased 75% since implementing comprehensive bias training," she reported. "Employee retention is up 40%. Customer loyalty has improved across all demographics, and the company has avoided over $600 million in potential discrimination lawsuits." The numbers told a story that even the most profit-focused executives couldn't ignore. Treating people with dignity wasn't just morally right, it was financially smart. Terrell Beaumont had become one of the most respected CEOs in America, but his focus remained on expanding the transformation beyond his own company. He was working with other industry leaders to establish mandatory bias training across the entire transportation sector, using federal contracting requirements to incentivize change. "We can't rely on corporate goodwill alone," he explained during a panel discussion. "Sustainable change requires structural incentives that make discrimination costly and equality profitable." The regulatory landscape had shifted dramatically as well. The Department of Transportation now required quarterly discrimination reporting from all commercial transportation companies. The Department of Justice had established a corporate bias investigation unit that conducted surprise audits of companies with federal contracts. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had gained new authority to impose financial penalties for systematic discrimination, creating real consequences for companies that failed to address bias in their operations. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The phrase Beaumont moment had entered the business lexicon, describing any situation where hidden institutional bias was suddenly exposed to public scrutiny. Corporate leaders now understood that discrimination wasn't just a legal or ethical issue. It was a reputation risk that could destroy decades of brand building in a matter of hours. The twins had used their platform to address broader issues beyond rail travel. They worked with hotels, restaurants, retail chains, and healthcare systems to implement accountability programs. Their book, When Dignity Demands Justice, had become required reading in business schools across the country. But they never forgot where their journey had begun or the people who had helped them along the way. Tabitha Ashworth was now Beaumont's Director of Employee Advocacy, leading programs that encouraged staff to report bias without fear of retaliation. Her secret recordings of discriminatory behavior had become a catalyst for creating safe spaces for witnesses to speak up. Calvin Hughes had been promoted to Chief Information Security Officer, not despite his decision to preserve evidence of discrimination, but because of it. His refusal to participate in the cover-up had demonstrated the kind of ethical leadership Beaumont now valued above all else. Even the employees who had initially discriminated against the twins had found new purposes. Nash Thornfield's sensitivity training programs had been adopted by 15 other transportation companies. Kimberly Langston's bias detection protocols were being implemented in transit systems nationwide. Their transformation from perpetrators to advocates proved that people could change when given the opportunity and support to examine their actions honestly. Preston Kingsley had quietly retired from corporate life, his attempted cover-up having destroyed his reputation and influence. But his downfall had sent a clear message to other executives. The old ways of protecting discriminatory systems were no longer sustainable. As the twins prepared to graduate, Shanice from Columbia Law, Renee from NYU Business, they reflected on how much had changed since that October morning at Union Station. The scared teenagers who had clutched their boarding passes and wondered if they belonged in first class had become confident young women who were reshaping corporate America. At their final college presentation, delivered jointly at a packed auditorium that drew students from across New York City, they shared the lessons they'd learned from their experience. The most important thing we discovered, Shanice told the audience, is that systems don't change themselves. They change when people refuse to accept injustice as normal, when they document what they experience, and when they have the courage to speak truth to power. Renee continued the thought, but individual courage alone isn't enough. Real change requires allies, people like Tabitha who preserve evidence, like Calvin, who refuse to participate in cover-ups, like the passengers who recorded what they saw and shared their own stories. The twins had learned that transformation happened through a combination of personal bravery and collective action. Their story had resonated precisely because it demonstrated how ordinary people could challenge extraordinary injustice and win. In the audience sat Zoe Williams, now 10 years old, the little girl who had approached them at the train station a year earlier. She was there with her school's Future Leaders Club, learning about advocacy and social change. For her generation, the idea that someone might be denied service or subjected to harassment because of their race seemed as archaic as denying women the vote or requiring separate water fountains. That was the twins' greatest victory, not the policy changes or corporate transformations, but the creation of a world where children like Zoe could assume they belonged everywhere they went. After the presentation, as students and faculty gathered for conversations about implementing change in their own organizations, Shanice and Renee stepped outside onto the Columbia campus. The crisp autumn air reminded them of that morning at Union Station when their journey had begun. "Do you ever think about what Dad said that day?" Renee asked. "About how transformation comes through fire." "Every day," Shanice replied. "But I also think about what we proved, that when you refuse to accept good enough as good enough, when you demand that institutions live up to their stated values, change is possible." They walked toward the subway, Two young women who had learned that the arc of justice doesn't bend toward equality on its own. It bends because people like them grab hold of it and pull. Their phones buzzed simultaneously with a news alert. Breaking. Federal Transportation Authority announces mandatory bias training for all commercial transportation employees based on Beaumont model. Renee smiled. "It looks like our work isn't done yet." "It never is," Shanice agreed. "But that's okay. Every generation has to choose whether to accept the world as it is or fight for the world as it should be." As they descended into the subway, joining the diverse crowd of New Yorkers heading home, they carried with them the knowledge that individual courage, when combined with institutional accountability, could create change that lasted far beyond any single story. The twins had started their journey as passengers denied boarding. They were ending it as leaders who had helped build a more just society. One policy change, one training program, one transformed heart at a time. Their father had been right about transformation coming through fire. But they had learned something even more important. When you refuse to be consumed by that fire, you can use it to forge something stronger and more beautiful than what existed before. The phone call that had shut down a railway had ultimately elevated an entire industry. The discrimination that was meant to diminish them had instead amplified their voices. The system that had tried to silence them had been forced to listen. And in conference rooms and training centers across America, in stations and boardrooms and courthouses, people were still learning the lesson that Shanice and Renee Beaumont had taught the world. That dignity is not negotiable, justice is not optional, and change is always possible when people have the courage to demand both. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Because in a world where discrimination still existed, there would always be more platforms to walk through, more systems to challenge, more victories to win. And somewhere at Union Station, at Platform 7 in Chicago, passengers of all backgrounds were boarding their trains with the dignity and respect that every human being deserved, the legacy of two teenagers who had refused to accept anything less. Thank you to everyone who typed respect, and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and justice. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth.